There's a sound only you can hear. No one else in the room detects it. Your partner sleeps right next to you, completely unaware. The TV is off. The house is quiet. And still, there it is. A high-pitched hiss. A low, dull drone. Sometimes a pulsing tone that syncs with nothing, follows no rhythm, answers to no logic. You've probably told yourself it's nothing. Fatigue, stress, you drank too much coffee. You'll sleep it off. But here's what I need you to understand. The people who sit across from me in clinical settings, people in their 50s, 60s, some in their early 70s, they all said the same thing at some point. They called it nothing. They waited. They adapted to the sound the way you adapt to a leaky faucet you've decided to ignore, and by the time they stopped ignoring it, the sound had already changed something inside them, not just in their ears, in their brain, in how they sleep, in how they think, in how they handle noise, conversation, silence. The ringing is not the problem. The ringing is the signal. Most people spend years treating tinnitus like a nuisance, like something that exists independently of everything else happening in their body. They buy white noise machines. They try earplugs. Some of them eventually see an audiologist who tells them their hearing is within normal range, and they walk out confused, thinking they imagined it. But they didn't imagine it. The audiologist just looked in the wrong direction. Because tinnitus doesn't always begin in your ears. What I want to walk you through today is something most people never hear explained this way. Not the list of possible causes, not the standard advice about avoiding loud music or reducing caffeine. I want you to understand what your auditory system is actually doing when you hear that sound, and why, for a significant portion of people over 50, it's a direct conversation between your nervous system and your brain. Let's start with something concrete. When you hear ringing in a completely silent room, your auditory cortex is generating activity without any external input. That's not poetic language. That's literally what's happening neurologically. Your brain is producing sound because it's compensating for a reduction in signal from the auditory nerve. Think of it the way you'd think about a stereo receiver turned up too high in a room where nothing is playing. The amplification is real. The source material isn't. Now here's where it gets interesting, and honestly, a little unsettling. The brain region responsible for amplifying that signal, the auditory cortex, shares real estate with areas governing attention, emotional regulation, and stress response. The structures that process the ringing are anatomically intertwined with the structures that decide how threatening something is. This is why tinnitus doesn't stay in your ears. It migrates. It starts waking you up at 3 a.m., not because the sound got louder, but because your threat detection system started tagging it as something that requires monitoring. Your brain, trying to protect you, accidentally turned the volume up. That's the trap. And understanding it is the first step to walking out of it. There's a pattern I see with a specific regularity. The person, almost always over 50, often someone who has been under prolonged low-grade stress, someone who sleeps poorly but not dramatically poorly, starts noticing the ringing most intensely in two specific moments, right before they fall asleep, and somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. Those aren't random windows. Those are the moments when the brain's ambient noise, the mental chatter, the environmental stimulation, the social input drops away, and the tinnitus, which was always there in the background, suddenly has the floor. It's not getting worse in those moments. It's getting unmistakable. And there's a second layer to this that almost no one talks about, honestly. Sleep deprivation, even partial and chronic, increases neural hyperactivity in the auditory cortex, meaning the worse you sleep because of the ringing, the more sensitized your auditory processing becomes, which makes the ringing more intrusive, which makes sleep harder. The cycle is real. The feedback loop operates regardless of whether you're aware of it. This is not a scare tactic. I'm telling you this because it means the intervention point is not your ears. It's your sleep architecture. It's your nervous system. And both of those are modifiable. If you're finding this useful, the kind of conversation that connects the dots your regular appointments usually skip, make sure you're subscribed. The material I cover in this channel is specifically built for people over 50 who are tired of generic advice and want to understand what's actually happening inside their bodies. Hit subscribe now, and you won't miss what's coming next. Now, let me tell you about the neck. It surprises almost everyone. But one of the most clinically under-recognized contributors to tinnitus in adults over 50 is cervicogenic, meaning it originates in the cervical spine. The muscles and joints of the upper neck share neurological pathways with the cochlear nucleus, which is the first relay station in your auditory processing system. When there's chronic tension, postural strain, or degenerative changes in the upper cervical vertebrae, that tension can alter the neural signals reaching your auditory brainstem. What does this feel like? Usually, nothing dramatic. Morning neck stiffness that you've chalked up to sleeping wrong, which happens so regularly you've stopped thinking of it as anything. A subtle tightness at the base of the skull. Occasional jaw tension. The kind of physical background noise that doesn't demand attention but never fully disappears. And many people who carry this pattern are completely unaware that it has anything to do with what they hear at night. The clinical term for this overlap is somatosensory tinnitus, and the reason it matters is that it responds to interventions that have nothing to do with your ears. Targeted manual therapy on the upper cervical region, postural correction, specific tension release protocols. These can produce real changes in tinnitus perception for people whose ringing has a somatic component. Not for everyone, but for a substantial subset, the path forward starts in the neck, not the audiologist's chair. There's another contributor that I want to be direct about, because I think it gets minimized in a way that genuinely harms people. Vascular tone, blood flow dynamics, the microcirculation inside the inner ear. The cochlea is one of the most metabolically demanding tissues in your body relative to its size. It runs almost entirely on oxidative metabolism, meaning it needs a consistent, clean supply of oxygenated blood. And the vessels supplying it are small, very small. They are among the first structures to show signs of compromise when there's systemic vascular dysfunction, the kind that builds quietly through your 40s and accelerates through your 50s. When blood flow to the cochlea becomes inconsistent, the hair cells, the sensory cells responsible for converting sound vibrations into nerve signals, start misfiring. When they misfire, the auditory nerve sends garbled signals upstream. The brain, receiving garbled signals, does its best to interpret them. What you hear as ringing is, in part, the sound of your brain attempting to make sense of corrupted input. This matters because many of the people I see with tinnitus also have other, quieter markers of circulatory strain. Slightly cold hands and feet. Occasional lightheadedness when standing too quickly. A tendency toward headaches that hover around the temples or the base of the skull. These aren't unrelated, they're different readings from the same underlying system. The body is consistent, it just speaks in a language most people haven't learned to translate yet. I'll give you something practical right now because I'm aware that a lot of health content tells you what's wrong and then sends you home with the problem. The approach that has shown the most consistent clinical impact for improving inner ear circulation is not supplementation, it's not medication, it's sustained physical activity, specifically the kind that drives consistent cardiovascular output for at least 20 to 30 minutes, several times per week, not because exercise fixes everything, but because the cochlea's vascular supply responds to the same hemodynamic conditions that improve elsewhere in the body, the vessels dilate, the microcirculation becomes more robust, the tissue gets more of what it needs. It doesn't happen in a week, but it happens. And the people who notice improvement after several months of genuine cardiovascular consistency are often the ones who assumed their tinnitus was simply permanent. Here's what I want you to consider. Drop a comment below and tell me, does your ringing get louder in silence, or does it seem worse right after noisy environments? That single detail tells me a significant amount about the mechanism driving yours. And I read these comments. The patterns I see in the responses genuinely shape what I cover next. Now let me tell you about something that happens during the night that most people don't know to connect to their ringing. Magnesium. Not in the way you're probably expecting. This isn't about taking a supplement and watching the sound disappear. The relationship is more specific than that and more structural. Magnesium plays a direct role in regulating the N-methyl-D-aspartate receptors in the auditory pathway, receptors that, when overactivated, contribute to the kind of neural excitability that generates phantom sounds. It also contributes to the structural stability of the outer hair cells in the cochlea, the same cells I mentioned earlier that are vulnerable to poor circulation. Magnesium deficiency is extraordinarily common in adults over 50 for reasons that have nothing to do with diet alone. Chronic stress depletes it, poor sleep depletes it, certain commonly used medications deplete it. Gastrointestinal changes that come with aging reduce its absorption. The result is that a large number of people are running systemically low on a mineral that is actively involved in both auditory nerve regulation and vascular tone. I'm not telling you to self-prescribe. I'm telling you that if you've never had your magnesium levels checked, specifically your red blood cell magnesium, which is far more accurate than a standard serum panel, that's a conversation worth having with your physician. Not because it's a cure, but because deficiency is common, testing is straightforward, and the downstream effects on auditory neural excitability are mechanistically real. Sleep position is the next thing, and I realize that sounds almost trivially simple, but bear with me because what I'm describing has a physical basis. The position in which you sleep changes the intracranial pressure dynamics, the drainage patterns of the lymphatic system surrounding your brain, and the venous return from your head. All of these affect the fluid dynamics of the inner ear. Some people notice a dramatic difference in tinnitus intensity depending on which side they sleep on or whether they elevate their head. This isn't anecdotal noise. The endolymphatic system of the inner ear is sensitive to position, and for people with certain types of tinnitus, particularly those with any involvement of the vestibular system or eustachian tube pressure, sleep position changes the acoustic environment they wake up into. A slight elevation of the head, not extreme, not medically dramatic, just enough to shift the venous drainage gradient, can reduce the sense of pressure and fullness that amplifies ringing for certain individuals. It costs nothing. It's worth trying deliberately for at least 2 weeks, consistently. The window between 10 p.m. and midnight deserves its own focus, not because of some arbitrary health metric, but because the neurological transition into deep sleep, particularly the slow wave stages, involves a downregulation of the auditory cortex's threat monitoring. The brain stops actively scanning for sounds, and if your nervous system is dysregulated by chronic tension, poor circadian signals, or insufficient melatonin transition, that downregulation gets delayed or disrupted, which means you lie there, listening. Light is the variable almost no one addresses seriously. The photoreceptors in your eyes, specifically the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, send timing signals directly to your suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's master clock, which governs melatonin production, which governs the cortisol slope of your late evening, which governs how smoothly your nervous system transitions out of the sympathetic dominant state of active life and into the parasympathetic dominant state of genuine rest. A nervous system that doesn't transition cleanly keeps the auditory threat monitoring partially active. The ringing stays audible, sleep becomes fractured. The morning arrives and you're already behind. The intervention is embarrassingly low-tech. Amber or red spectrum light in the 2 hours before bed. No overhead lights if possible, no bright screens at full intensity. The brain interprets blue spectrum light as daylight. You cannot ask it to wind down for sleep while simultaneously telling it it's noon. This is the kind of thing that sounds like lifestyle advice, and it is, but the mechanism is endocrine and neurological, not motivational. I want to stay with you for one more layer before I leave you with the most important reframe I can offer on this. If you've been dealing with tinnitus for more than a few months, something has happened that's worth naming clearly. Your brain has started incorporating the sound into its baseline. This is called habituation when it goes well, and sensitization when it goes badly. The direction it goes depends almost entirely on the emotional valence your nervous system attaches to the sound. When the brain decides the ringing is neutral, when it processes it the way it processes the hum of a refrigerator, the auditory cortex gradually reduces the priority it assigns to the signal. The sound doesn't disappear, but it recedes. It stops commanding attention. People in this state often describe realizing midday that they haven't noticed the ringing in hours. When the brain decides the ringing is threatening, and this happens especially when it disrupts sleep, which we're wired to protect, it does the opposite. It assigns it high priority. It monitors it. Every quiet moment becomes a test. Every night becomes a performance review. The nervous system's relationship to the sound matters as much as the sound's origin. This is not a psychological dismissal of what you're experiencing. It's the opposite. It means the path through tinnitus, the actual neurological path, runs directly through your autonomic nervous system's threat calibration, which means the body level work, sleep, circulation, physical tension, mineral availability, light exposure, nervous system regulation, isn't supplementary to treating tinnitus. For many people, it is the treatment. If you made it this far and you've been living with this sound, maybe for months, maybe for years, I want to leave you with something concrete. Not a supplement list, not a hopeful promise. Just this. The brain that learned to amplify that sound is the same brain that can learn to deprioritize it. But it needs different inputs than the ones you've been giving it. It needs consistent sleep pressure, lower arousal in the hours before bed, better vascular health, reduced neurological excitability. These things don't happen by wanting them to. They happen by systematically removing what's keeping the system activated. Start with one thing tonight. Dim every light in your living space 2 hours before you intend to sleep. Not as a ritual, as a neurological signal. Give your brain something it can actually work with. The ringing is your auditory system trying to tell you something. The question is whether you're ready to change what you're feeding it.